This is David Harvey, and you're listening to the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles, a podcast that looks at capitalism through a Marxist lens. This podcast is made possible by democracy at work. There are times and moments in my life when I learn something which somehow or other changes everything and makes me rethink a lot of positions that I've had. Sometimes it's something I learn theoretically. This is the sort of thing that has often come to me from closer contemplation of what Marx has to say. But on other occasions, it's just a piece of information. And I came across a piece of information about 4 months ago that really, literally blew my mind and made me rethink a lot of my positions. And the information was this. It was a graph put out by the National Atmospheric and Oceanic Administration, NOAA, which was a graph of carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere over the last 800,000 years. Now, 800,000 years seems a long time, but geologically it's not so long. But on the other hand, it's long enough to capture phases of global warming and cooling and all the rest of it. And at no point in the last 800,000 years has the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere gone above 300 parts per million. It's oscillated, in fact, between 150 parts per million and 300 parts per million over those 800,000 years, the high points being the 300 parts per million. And it hit 300 parts per million about 20 years ago. But over the last 20 years, it's gone from 300 parts per million to 400 parts per million. Now that's a huge, huge increase. And it's actually something which is way, way beyond anything that's been experienced over the last 800,000 years. And the implications and why it happened have been absorbing me a lot. One of the implications, of course, would be if that Donald Trump hears about it, he will abolish NOAA, the organization that published this document, or at least instruct it that it shall not put out any more information of this kind. But the increase and the incredible amount of it means that the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere already is very, very high, and something which is absolutely inimical to the continuation of human habitation. What this means, in effect, is that all the ice doesn't just melt overnight. It's going to take, 50, maybe 100 years to do it, but it's going to go. And if it goes, then we're going to get sea rise. We're going to get things like the Himalaya snowpack is going to disappear, which is going to mean the Indus rivers and the Ganges rivers are essentially going to run dry. You're going to have chronic drought through all of the all of the Indian, South Asian area. So this 400 parts per million, where did it come from and what happened? And I'm here going to venture onto some very awkward terrain because, for this reason, that one answer is China and what has happened in China. And I want to get to that in a minute. But we should not discount something else, which is the runaway character of global climate change and what that's about. And this runaway character is signaled by things like, if climate change actually melts the Arctic permafrost, then the melting of the permafrost will release methane gases, so that, in a sense, global climate change produces more global climate change, and that's not an unfamiliar thing. So there may be a lot of that going on right now, which can partly account for it. But this shooting up changes my attitude to the question of climate change and what to do about it. And here I'm going to have to backtrack a little bit to talk about the general view I would take about environmental questions and environmental issues over time, over the last 50 years, in effect, since I first became conscious of it. When I was a student, there was a great deal of agitation in the world about that the Earth was running out of a viable resource base. And the resource that people were worried about most at that time was oil and fossil fuel possibilities. And this was in the 1950s. into the 1960s. Throughout the 1960s, there was further agitation. By the time we got to 1972, there was a great deal of preoccupation with limits to growth. There was a great literature coming out suggesting that the environmental capacities of the Earth were not limitless and that therefore a crisis was impending. There was a great deal of agitation around this. This was the time when Earth Day was declared. It was a time when even corporate America started to wake up to the fact that there might be an environmental problem. I always remember Forbes magazine had a special issue on the limits that existed in the environment, and the first essay in that Forbes magazine was by Richard Nixon, who basically said, we have to care for the environment, we can't always dominate it, and so there was a sort of acceptance on the part of political power that there might be some issue here. And the Forbes magazine had a few wonderful kind of ideas about what should happen, and in particular on urbanization. There was this kind of designs for new cities, and the designs for new cities had lots of trees around and all this kind of stuff, so typical kind of what we now call greenwashing going on from the corporate sector. But the radical sector was doing things like the California students faced with the oil spill off Santa Barbara and the oil drilling off the California coast, buried a Chevy in the sands as a sort of symbolic protest against the excessive use of fossil fuels and reliance on fossil fuels. So there was a great deal of agitation. And I remember at the time going to the Earth Day, which I think was the first year was 1972. And I sort of wrote about this later, and I kind of said, Earth Day was a very important point where people were agitating about food qualities and air qualities and the like. But what struck me was that Earth Day was essentially an audience that in the city of Baltimore, which was a 50% African-American city, there was hardly any African-Americans present. It was entirely a white middle-class audience, and I was very struck by the fact that the environmental issue was very much seen that way. And I always recall that the same week I went to this sort of Earth Day, I went to a place called the Left Bank Jazz Club in Baltimore, which is a very predominantly black institution where, there were just a smattering of white people around. And, of course, the music was great. And I remember the musicians on that occasion talked about environmental problems. And to great cheers from the audience, they said, look, our biggest environmental problem is Richard Nixon. And I always thought at the time that actually this was a very important gap there was in an understanding of what constitutes an environmental problem. And my experience up to then and since has been that I'm very nervous about a lot of the environmentalist rhetoric. And in particular, that wing of the environmentalist movement that proclaims that apocalypse is coming any time now, that the world is going to run out, everything is going to go to disaster. And I've always resisted apocalyptic renditions, which is not to say that I think that environmental questions are irrelevant. In fact, I think they're very relevant. I think that we need to take care of them and deal with them as they come up. But I didn't actually share a lot of the apocalyptic visions which were around at that time and have been around ever since. So without the apocalyptic vision, the approach to the environmental questions is one of taking them seriously and managing them so that we deal with air and water pollution and carbon concentrations through regulation, regulatory activity, and the like, and we don't get into a panic about, it has to be done tomorrow or everything is going to collapse. And back in the 70s, there was, of course, this famous bet between Julian Simon, an economist, and Paul Ehrlich, an environmentalist, who insisted that the world was suffering seriously from overpopulation, that we were going to run out of resources, and that the food supply was going to be curtailed, and that we were going to have, therefore, damage. And Julian Simon basically said, no, that's not the case. And they had a bet in which Julian Simon said, in 10 years' time, we're going to see that basically all basic commodity prices are going to be cheaper than they now are, which signals that there's not a serious problem in the environment. And Ehrlich took the bet, and 10 years later, they looked at all the commodity prices and looked at what happened between 1970 and 1980, and it turned out that Julian Simon won the bet. And Paul Ehrlich had to eat his hat, or whatever it was they agreed upon would be the cost of losing the bet. Now, some people pointed out since, actually, Ehrlich lost the bet because 1970 was a bad year to start the bet. In other words, if you start the bet at a time when commodity prices are high, the likelihood is strong that they're going to go down over the following decade. If you started it when commodity prices were low, it would be the other way around. And as somebody's pointed out since, if you started the bet in 1980 and looked at the prices that happened during the 1980 to 1990, Ehrlich would have been right. So actually, this kind of question of, are we in a difficult environmental situation or are we not, has been around for a long time. There's what they call cornucopians, those who think that there's an almost limitless capacity for the environment to absorb what human beings are doing, and the apocalyptic scenario folk who kind of think there's going to be a dismal future. And of course, that is the Malthusian bet that was made a very long time ago that kind of said that greater and greater levels of population are going to actually lead to constraints on resources and are going to produce international famine and poverty and degradation and all the rest of it. So there's been a long-standing debate about this, and I've always taken the view that we should take environmental questions seriously, but I don't accept these apocalyptic visions. But that really changed when I saw that 400 figure. That 400 figure is such that it says that essentially it's not the rate of carbon emissions that we should be looking at, but we have to start to look at the absolute level of carbon concentrations in the atmosphere, because that level, where it is now, is going to guarantee that we're going to start to see desiccation, we're going to see very rapid increase in global temperatures, and I think that this therefore suggests that the policy of restricting the rate of carbon emissions, which is what we mainly talk about these days, has to be changed. We have to look at how we can actually decrease the existing concentrations. Now, in an earlier talk, I talked a little bit about the difference between thinking about the world in terms of rates of change and thinking about the world in terms of absolute masses of change. And I mentioned the case in which if you have a very low level of starting, you can have a very high rate of change with very little impact. If you have a very high mass, then a small rate of change can produce a vast increase in the mass. For instance, if I ask you the question, would you rather have $100 and be offered a 10% rate of return on $100, or would you rather have $1 million and be offered a 3% rate of return? Because 3% on $1 million is darn sight more than 10% on 100. So actually the mass is terribly important. And this situation right now of the mass is something that has to be addressed. Now, this has led me to think about these questions a little bit more in terms of where did that increase in mass come from? And here we do have some data which suggests that one of the huge increases in the mass came with the development in China after 2000, which was a massive development in infrastructures. And I've been fond of showing a graph of cement construction. Cement utilization in China, which increases at a huge rate, and such that China consumed in 2.5 years about 45% more cement than the United States consumed in 100 years. And I've cited that on these programs before. So what that means is that China was expanding at a very rapid rate, and that the rapidity of its expansion accelerated in the crisis of 2007, 2008. because China's export market collapsed, and it therefore substituted an infrastructural program of development in a way that the rest of the world would not tolerate. The rest of the world went into austerity. China went into expansionism. And as I've argued several places, and there's credible evidence on this, China effectively saved global capitalism from a crash in 2007, 2008 by undertaking the expansion. It didn't do the expansion because it wanted to save global capitalism. It did it because it was the only way in which it could absorb surplus labor, which was in abundance with the crash of the export industries. They had, 30 million people unemployed. They had to put them to work somehow, so they put them to work in this infrastructural expansion. Going along with this infrastructural expansion was an expansion of the internal economy in China, an expansion of internal consumerism in China, and so China has actually leapt in its economic standing to the point where actually in terms of purchasing power parity, it is now the largest economy in the world, larger than the United States, and it's leapt into that position through this massive expansion. But then you look at the graph of carbon greenhouse gas emissions from China. It accelerates. It accelerates so that it goes from a relatively modest quantity in, say, 2004 to suddenly becoming a massive quantity in 2007, 2008 through this developmental program. Actually, the production of cement itself produces a lot of greenhouse gases. And so I have a little graph which talks about the amount of greenhouse gases which comes from increasing cement production. And it's, again, something that's very significant. So here we have a situation in which saving global capitalism, which China did, actually meant a massive increase in greenhouse gas emissions, and those massive increase in greenhouse gas emissions carries over into this leap from 300 parts per million to 400 parts per million. Now, there are other reasons for that. China wasn't the only place that was developing in this way. Some other parts of the world were also. If you look at expansionism in say, Brazil and in Turkey during these years, you'll find some of the same sorts of things. So here's then is the one situation. Now, what are the implications of this? The implications of this is that we should not be discussing the rates of change and trying to limit rates of change. What the discussion should be about something else, which is how to extract carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere as much as we can. That is partly done naturally through the absorption of carbon dioxide into oceans and the like. And in the oceans, of course, it gets turned in by shellfish into shells and all the rest of it. So there's a way in which there is a natural way of absorption. But in effect, what we need to do is to come up with ways of doing it through agriculture. Because remember, the carbon concentrations underground and all of that energy which is concentrated underground was done over millions of years back in preceding epochs. And the way that it happened was through vegetation and to some degree crustaceans and the right of it, absorbing more and more of energy and taking it, putting it underground. And so we've taken all of that stored energy underground, which came from the way in which vegetation and animals and lively things stored it underground for us, and we've now released it. Now we've got to get into a situation where the only way, it seems to me, we can start to talk seriously about getting that 400 back down to 300 parts per million is that the only way we can do that is by finding means to get the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and back underground. How do we do that? Well, vegetation is the answer. Now, we know that one of the ways we can do something about this is through reforestation. But reforestation is limited. It's limited to new growth forests. And so by reforesting the world, we could, in fact, actually reduce the carbon dioxide content of the atmosphere. And so there have been reforestation schemes. And in the Northern Hemisphere, in fact, there's been a net increase of forest cover. The big problem has been, of course, the Amazon areas and the tropical rainforests, where Sumatra, Borneo, and all the rest of it, where there's been an incredible attack upon the vegetation in those areas and the deforestation of Amazonia. And, of course, with Bolsonaro in Brazil, coming to power. He's the same as Donald Trump. He doesn't believe in any kind of this climate change nonsense. And so they're actually going to expand the attack upon Amazonia in order to make it open to soybean cultivation, beef raising, and all the rest of it. So reforestation is one option. The other option, and I'm not an expert on this, and I've only just come across this recently, so some of you may want to go out there and check this out, is there are forms of cultivation which take the carbon dioxide and put it back underground. Now, you can put it underground 6 inches or something like that, or a foot or two, but if you deep plow, then you release it again. So agricultural techniques come in here and say, well, if you're growing crops which do this, but they don't do it very deep underground, then you can't plow. So there's going to be a radical change in agricultural technology and agricultural techniques. But there are also crops, and I don't know exactly what they are, but they've been sort of talked about, which put the carbon dioxide 6 feet underground. They take it deep down underground, which means there's a deep-rooted system that takes the carbon dioxide and puts it that depth. If we can cultivate crops of that kind, then we could start a process of extracting carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and putting it back underground. This, to me, seems to me to be something which is very important. But how do we get farmers to do this? And what will it take? And what impact will it have on agriculture to do that? Well, actually, there is one sign of hope here, that in the European Union and also in the United States, there are programs which pay farmers not to grow anything, because there is an agricultural surplus, and therefore you need to take certain land out of production. Well, instead of paying them to grow nothing, why wouldn't we pay them to grow the kinds of crops which actually put the carbon dioxide underground? Now, how much of this you would need to do in order to get it down from 400 to 300 parts a minute, I have no idea. But these are the sorts of techniques and technologies that need to be deployed. So both in terms of the production of greenhouse gas emissions, and there have to be sort of reductions on the rate of it. We're not going to stop doing that, but at the same time, we also need to be seriously considering how to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and bring it back underground from whence it came. So when I kind of say that this was a mind-blowing thing for me, it was in the sense that it is such a dramatic shift in the trajectory of carbon dioxide emissions that this goes from something which was, seemed to me to be manageable by normal techniques, to a radical transformation of all of our ways of thinking, all of our ways of proceeding, not only in terms of reducing fossil fuel consumption and reducing the rate of carbon emissions, but also actually starting now to think more seriously about finding ways to bring the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and bring it back underground. As I said, there are some natural ways in which this occurs. For instance, the absorption of carbon dioxide in oceans is an important carbon dioxide sink. But the problem with that is that there's an acidification of the oceans, and the oceans become problematic because they change the quality of the oceanic waters. So I would like to suggest that all of us think more seriously about this climate change problem and carbon dioxide emissions, and to think about it both in these ways of controlling the continuing increase of those emissions, as we see has occurred in China, but not only in China, but in all emerging markets around the world. We have to think about curbing that. But as those countries complain when people from the United States or Britain or Europe say that you shouldn't be doing this, they kind of say, well, you did it for 100 years and you got to be developed to where you are right now, so why shouldn't we do it for the next 100 years? And of course, there's a certain truth to that. So carbon emissions from India, carbon emissions from China have all been increasing, from Brazil, from Turkey, and so on, have all been increasing. But we have to find a way to construct economic development which is not based on increasing carbon intensity and the increasing use of fossil fuels. So I think there is an emergency. There's an emergency that needs to be actually come into our consciousness and change things. And notice that in all of this, the big problem is capital accumulation. That capital accumulation in China required that they develop in the way they did. The sustenance of global capitalism after 2007, 2008 was largely rescued by China and by the emerging markets who engaged in this radical expansion. So we've got a situation in which the survival of capitalism depended upon an expansionist project in all of those countries, which actually expanded carbon dioxide emissions to the point where it suddenly shot up. And I think it's significant that it's over the last 20 years that this has suddenly shot up to the point where the carbon concentrations, which are now in the atmosphere, the existing concentrations, are already a serious part of the problem that the global community has to address, and has to address it quickly and as fast as possible. And now I want to get back to other aspects of the environmental question, and I'll do that in a subsequent podcast. Thank you for joining me today. You've been listening to David Harvey's Anti-Capitalist Chronicles, a Democracy at Work production. A special thank you to the wonderful Patreon community for supporting this project.